Welcome to the Elliott Museum in Stuart, Florida. My name is John Giltonan. I'm the curator for the antique vehicle collection here at the Elliott. Today we're going to talk about one of the crown jewels of the museum's collection. It's a 1914 Packard Model 238 7-passenger Phaeton. This is a very rare and a very special car, and I hope you'll enjoy this this introduction to it. The Packard Automobile Company was founded in Warren, Ohio in 1899 by James Ward and William Dowd Packard. They were brothers. They had a successful company called Packard Electric that made electrical cable. That company would go on to become a subsidiary of General Motors, and the Packard Electric name would appear on the ignition wires of General Motors cars well into the 1970s. The story of how the car company came to be is sort of interesting. There was a gentleman in Cleveland named Alexander Winton who started to make cars in 1899, and Mr. James Packard bought the 12th Winton that Mr. Winton made. The car was not very reliable. Mr. Packard, being an engineer, couldn't resist fixing it and then calling Mr. Winton up to complain about its weaknesses and suggest his improvements. After several of these calls, Mr. Winton stated, "If you can build a better car, go on and do it." Well, you should be careful what you wish for, because the Packard brothers did build a better car. Packard quickly established itself as the leading luxury car manufacturer in the United States. They had a model called the Model 30, which was a large four-cylinder car. In 1912, they introduced two six-cylinder engines. The Model 48 was a 525 cubic inch 6 built on a 144-inch wheelbase. That car produced about 80 horsepower. The Model 38, which is what this car is, has a 415 cubic inch inline 6 that produced 60 horsepower, and those cars were built on a 140-inch wheelbase. So while this is technically the smaller model, it is still an enormous car, and these were very expensive cars. It sold for well over $4,000 in 1914. You could buy a nice house for that at the time. When this car was introduced, Packard incorporated a number of important engineering advances that I would like to point out. In 1912, Cadillac had introduced the self-starter, which really made gasoline engines much more popular because you didn't have to crank start them anymore. This is one of the first Packards to incorporate a self-starter, and when they put the self-starter on these cars, they also switched from using acetylene headlamps to electric headlamps. They changed the bright work from brass to nickel silver. Nickel silver doesn't have to be polished as often as brass. It does have to be polished, but it's not as maintenance intensive as brass. They also moved the driver from the right-hand side of the car to the left-hand side of the car to give the driver better visibility of oncoming traffic. I'm going to open the hood here and start the engine, and then we'll talk about the engine a little bit. To start the car, it's a fairly involved process, especially when the car's cold. You pump this pump until you get enough pressure in the fuel tank to push the gas up to the engine, and then you can start the car. Recently, we sprung a leak in that system, so we put a fuel pump on it, which makes life a little easier. The starter button is on the floor here. This is a 415 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine. The cylinders are cast in pairs of 3 cylinders. So you have 1, 2, 3 in one block, 4, 5, 6 in the second block. The starter generator is back here. The magneto is here. The fan is a big cast aluminum piece. They put these gate switches on the spark plugs so that if you had a plug that fouled, you could reach up and disengage the spark plugs until you found the one that was fouling. Now, I've been shocked in the past by a spark plug, and there is just no way I'm going to grab onto one of those things and do that, but they said you can, so I'll take their word for it. You have these brass plugs in here in order to service the valves, because the cylinder heads do not come off. So the valves are in the block and they're vertical, and in order to take them out to service them, you have to remove these plugs. So there's one for the intake and one for the exhaust on each cylinder. You notice that the radiator mascot has a 6 on it, because they were very proud of that. That was a big deal to have a 6-cylinder engine in 1914. It really put them in the luxury class without any question. The transmission on this car is a sliding gear transmission, but it doesn't use the H pattern that we're familiar with today. All the gears are in a straight line, and they are not synchro-meshed. They're straight cut gears, which is always exciting, but we're gonna hopefully be able to film me shifting the thing into second gear here in a second. Car's not easy to steer. That's why people had chauffeurs. Kind of have to float it in. Ha! How about that? This car is a 7-passenger touring car or Phaeton. It's an open car, and Phaetons or touring cars do not have roll-up windows in the doors. So in the wintertime, even when you put the top up, the only way you can have any weather protection is to put these cumbersome side curtains on the sides of the car. They're difficult to install, they're drafty. These cars were cold and unpleasant in the wintertime, but they're lovely in the summer. The jump seats are designed to fold up and twist to get them out of the way. The upholstery is black leather. It's button tufted, and the seats are stuffed with horsehair. They're very comfortable. This car was partially restored in 1957. The seats were reupholstered and the car was repainted, but it was not fully restored. The undercarriage is original, and I'll show you some features that are original to the car. This thing here is called a lap robe. So you would hang a lap robe or a blanket on it, And that way, when it was cold in the wintertime, you could bundle up in the blanket. It also makes it a little easier to get in and out of the car. If you look at the carpeting on the bottoms of the doors, the faded carpeting is original to the car. The door panels might be original. I'm not certain about that. But the car has a lot of original features, which is pretty unusual for a car that's over 100 years old. The body was built really using coach building techniques. So the body is all framed in wood, and then they just hung the sheet metal on that framing. The doors, the hinges for the doors are screwed into wood posts. These cars were susceptible to wood rot. A lot of times the wood would start to rot and the doors would fall off, and people would junk a perfectly good car, mechanically good, but the body had deteriorated to the point where it was no longer serviceable. So that's another reason why it's so amazing that this car still exists. It's a very capable car. I've had it up to 50 miles an hour out here on Ocean Drive, and it does just fine. But the consideration is that these early cars only have brakes on the rear wheels. They hadn't figured out how to apply brakes to the wheels that were steering the car. And that didn't become common until about 1925. So you don't have a whole lot of braking power in this car. And if somebody were to get in front of you and jump on their brakes in a modern car, you might run over them. So we have to be very careful when we drive this car on public streets. The body, as I mentioned before, is made largely of wood. The door is all framed in wood, and the sheet metal is screwed on to the door frame. And you can see the wood. The door hinges are screwed into a post that's in here supporting the cowl of the car. You can see these beautiful nickel silver door handles, which are just a direct relation to the old carriage door handles. The car companies didn't fully eliminate wood from the construction of car bodies until the mid-1930s. I have a 1937 Buick Roadmaster, and it still has wood in the body on that car. That's one reason why you don't see very many cars made before World War II. The wood just didn't hold up in many cases, and it's very expensive to repair. These are 36 by 4.5 inch wide wheels. And when you look at the rear wheels, you can see that the spokes, there are more spokes than there are on the front wheels, and they're heavier spokes because the wheel is bolted directly to the brake drum, and all the braking is being done by the two rear wheels. The car really stops amazingly well, considering the fact that it only has two-wheel brakes. But as I said, you have to be very careful because there's a lot of stupid out there on the roads, and people don't appreciate the fact that these old cars need a little more room to stop than a modern car. If you look at the springs, you can see the remnants of this yellow pinstriping. That's from the factory. The undercarriage of this car has never been restored. It was repainted and freshened up in 1957 when Mr. Ralph Evinrude bought the car. These are grease fittings to pump grease into the, you turn them a little bit and they pump grease into the springs. Look at that gas cap. It's a solid piece of brass and it's nickel plated. It weighs about 3 pounds. The quality that they put into these cars was unbelievable. The tail light here is another very beautiful thing. It was designed so that it could work on electric or kerosene. There's a little reservoir underneath it that you could put kerosene in, so that if you were running the car on the magneto and not using the electric lights, you could light the kerosene light so that people behind you would know the car was there at night. You could also remove this lamp and carry it around if you needed it at night to help change a tire or service the engine. This is a klaxon horn, and it's designed to run off electricity, or it has a squeeze bulb that you could squeeze it and honk it manually. We also have a very interesting spotlight up here, which had an adjustment on it so that you could widen or narrow the beam and focus in on something if you were looking at a mailbox or something like that to try and determine where you were in the dark. So that's an interesting feature. This car came to the museum in 1972. It was donated by Mr. Ralph Evinrude, who was the president of the Evinrude Outboard Boat Motor Company. Mr. Evinrude was married to Frances Langford, the actress. They lived here in Stuart and were a very, very important part of this community for many years. The story about the Packard dates back to 1914 and Mr. Evinrude's parents. His father, Ole Evinrude, founded the Evinrude Boat Motor Company. His wife was a partner with him and worked very, very hard to help establish the company. In 1914, her health was failing, and Mr. Evinrude Sr. decided that it was time for them to take some time off and travel and get away from the business. So he actually sold his first company and bought a 1914 Packard identical to this car. It was not this car, it was identical to this car. And he and Mrs. Evinrude and their son, Ralph, struck out on a cross-country adventure. They drove that Packard all over the country. They wrote a book about it. Mrs. Evinrude's health recovered, and the trip was so important to Ralph and his growing up that when he was an adult, he went out and he found a car identical to his father's Packard. He bought this car in 1957 and kept it until 1972 when he gave it to the museum. They only made 1,400 of these cars in 1914. The survival rate is virtually nil. There's probably only about 4 or 5 of these cars left, and it is, as I said, one of the crown jewels of our collection, and I'm very honored to be able to look after it and drive it and share it with you. In closing, I would like to say I hope you've enjoyed this video. We hope to do more of these. I want to point out that the coronavirus has been extremely hard on all the not-for-profits in this area, including the Elliott. And I would just ask that you consider any kind of a donation that you might be in a position to make to the museum. If your membership has lapsed, please renew it and consider stepping it up a class. We really need and appreciate your help. Thanks very much.